Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Travis Hoffman. I serve as the Extension Sheep Specialist for North Dakota State University and the University of Minnesota. And we are driven to discover. And so I appreciate the chance to get to introduce a couple of our talented individuals that will help us on this evening's webinar. Miss Jessica Spreitzer, Director of Trade Analysis, and Miss Courtney Heller, Director of Export Services. Both of these talented individuals work for the U.S. Meat Export Federation. And one of the functions, and kind of as we think about it from U.S. Meat Export Federation, and they'll talk about that as well, is just looking at international lamb trade. And we've tasked them with providing some of the opportunities and future successes that we can have in the sheep and lamb industry. And they both come from a long background, in fact, of kind of understanding both the analysis of, truthfully, the U.S. red meat industry and the global trade to both domestic and international stakeholders. And so I'm excited that we get to have them to join us. I think this is a fun topic. In fact, it's been on a little bit of my bucket list. All right, Courtney, even when we talked strangely in June, right? And so said, you know what, we need to make this happen. We waited just a little bit so that we got some of the 2023 data to kind of summarize and kind of pull together. And in fact, that's a large part of Jessica's game of pulling together some information. So we waited here until February of 2024 to kind of connect some of those dots and pull things together. And so I am excited, as you are aware, for those individuals that have joined us, is that in the chat box, please feel free to put the questions that you may have in the chat box for us, and then we will attack those and get those answered either as part of our conversation or at the end. And either of them work very, very well for us. And so we appreciate, again, just a tremendous amount of dialogue. And so we've got a great group and a great audience. And Jessica, I'm going to point it to you, and you can share your screen. But ladies and gentlemen, with a quick internet applause, this will be Jessica and Courtney kind of helping to facilitate our discussion for the evening. Good job.
Great. Thanks so much, Travis. Yes, so here over the next half hour to an hour, Courtney and I are going to dive into the international trade dynamics. And as Travis said, we have the fresh data hot off the press that was released yesterday for the year-end stats. So we'll talk through that a little bit. But before we get in to more specifics on some of the import and export data and some of the trends that we see in our main markets, we're just going to give you a bit of a brief info on the U.S. Meat Export Federation, which is the nonprofit trade association for red meat exports for the U.S. So for beef, pork, lamb, and veal. So here's our mission statement. And what I really want to emphasize here is that we have participation across sectors, and that helps make us a little more unique because we are representing the space all the way from the producer level through to the packer and exporter level. So we represent beef, pork, and lamb on the production side. And then we also have support from the feed grain and oilseed industries, as well as they recognize the importance of exports and driving the need for increased feed for those industries, as well as related agribusinesses and other allied industries, all the way through traders and exporters. And Courtney and I are both here from our U.S. headquarters. So I am located in Denver, where our office is, and then we have a few staff like Courtney located in other parts of the U.S. But the majority of our staff is located in the international market. So we have a little over 100 staff, and about 70 of those are located around the world. So this is our boots on the ground. They are really passionate about U.S. red meat products. They are all from within the market, so they understand the dynamics and marketing within their individual markets. And this is really what is our strength, is our international staff. And I'm going to try and highlight, I have a lot of charts and data, but we'll try to pull in a lot of the insights that we hear from our international staff as well, so that you get some of that information. And now I'll turn it over to Courtney to talk a little bit more about her department.
All right, sorry, I got booted off. Can you guys all hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay,
Yeah.
awesome. So, sorry about that. I'm glad I logged in just in time. Uh, I'm Courtney Heller. One thing Travis didn't mention is I'm also a sheep producer. I live in Southeast Michigan, and we're fourth generation on our sheep farm down here, and we're up here depending on where you're located. And the lamb industry means a lot to me, and I'm really excited to work in exports in general, but also that I get to have a role in the lamb segment of things. Like Jessica was saying, I work in technical services. There are four of us. Three of us focus on the day-to-day technical issues. Our primary role is to help our members with any issues they may have with trade, anything from like a paper or a document issue all the way to these far-reaching goals that might take a few years to develop new trade opportunities or break down some trade barriers that are in place. Um, so we do that, but we also work with USDA to help streamline the export process. We often liaison between our members and USDA to try to cut down on the amount of phone calls that USDA gets direct from industry. If we can kind of streamline 200 calls into one, it helps everybody be efficient and get things done in a timely and efficient way. One of our the aspects of our job is also to understand new regulations as they come out. Sometimes we can help explain to industry or even the government or even the foreign government what different things mean and how it impacts the market. And another role of ours is to provide feedback on behalf of industry to our government if there are any impending changes, either in our regulations or in foreign government regulations. And we do this with our industry partners, which are other associations, including ASI, NPPC, NCBA, NAMI, USAPEAC, and Global Cold Chain Alliance. And I am not able to turn my camera on, guys. I'm sorry. It will crash if I do. Like many of you, I live in the country and I normally go to the library to do these, but they closed already. So I was hoping I could do this and make sure my kids stayed off the internet and it would be a success. So we're always available if any of you guys have questions. Me and my counterparts, Jim and Paige, about these different markets and opportunities. Go ahead, Jessica.
Thanks, Courtney. So Courtney and I are both a little bit unique in our departments because most of our staff is focused on marketing. So, being a nonprofit trade association, our purpose is the international marketing for beef, pork, and lamb. But as Courtney mentioned, export services is critical to helping those exports flow. So we have staff on that side. And then also in my department, which is the trade analysis department, there are three of us and we are focused heavily in the data. And so a lot of this is for reporting back to USDA and other funding sources. And also a big portion of what we do is for international buyers. So providing data on the markets, building trust with the US, and really, one big advantage that we have is all the data that we do have from USDA that is very unique compared to many of our competitors. So that helps us have another tool. A lot of times when we're talking to buyers, they just don't understand why prices for US products are so high. So we can use some of the data from USDA to show, demand is really holding in there. These are some of the driving factors for why demand is so strong, and that's helping support prices. And so we can kind of help paint that picture, and then they can feel more comfortable when they're getting these quotes for higher prices and feel like, they're not just being told something without having anything to back that up. So we do spend time providing information to our international staff and the buyers, but a lot of what we do as well is focused on reporting back to the industry side here on what's going on with exports and providing those insights. And one of our main outputs is that we run the monthly stats from USDA for an agricultural service for beef, pork, and lamb. And so this is just a snapshot of a page of our website. So we have this posted. This can be accessed at any time, and it always has the latest stats, the latest month available. So you can kind of see towards the bottom here of the screen, we have a lamb section. So you can always check that out if you're interested to see what is going on with the latest trends. This is just usmef.org. And then right, if you click on the trade and statistics tab, you can get to the export statistics. So we have this information. We're always happy to answer questions as well if you want to reach out with any questions. And I'm going to talk through the details from this export statistics page here in the next few slides. So before we get in to export statistics specifically for the US, I want to talk about global exports and imports a little bit more. And I do have a lot of charts. Not every slide will be a chart, so just bear with me and we'll talk through some of this. But setting the stage, you know, our major global importers, all my charts will say sheep muscle cuts. I'm just looking at lamb and mutton muscle cuts here. I'm not including variety meats in the data. That's a pretty quite a minor share of overall global trade. So we're just looking at the muscle cuts in these charts. And of course, our big four, the big four importers, China, EU, US, and UK. And China is by far the leading importer. It is also, you know, the top producer, consumer of lamb and mutton as well. So China is a major driver in the global marketplace. And we've seen Australia really be the driver with larger supplies to China as that big increase to those record volumes you can see on the chart for 2023 for China. EU and UK are supplied primarily by each other, as well as New Zealand is a leading supplier there, and Australia. And we'll talk about US imports a little bit more here in a minute. But just to summarize, you know, apart from those markets, the main global importers are mostly located in Asia and the Middle East. Canada is one of the outliers there. And of course, that's one of our export markets as well, being our neighbor and our partner with the USMCA free trade agreement. So as I mentioned, you know, on the last slide, you can see that the US is one of the top importers of lamb. By far, the majority of supplies are from Australia and New Zealand. We have minimal volumes coming from Chile and from Uruguay. Also, you know, we haven't really seen momentum picking up from Ireland and the UK, so very minimal volumes, not really any notable increase in shipments there. As you can see in that others category is pretty small. So Australia and New Zealand by far being the top suppliers. And Australia's imports from Australia had increased in 2021 and 2022. And we saw that pullback last year in 2023 with Australia's volumes back to pre-COVID levels, so back to 2019 levels. And now looking at the picture for just global exports. So now this is showing the top exporters. Again, you can see the dominance of Australia and the huge surge to record exports in 2023. That surge for Australia was driven by larger exports to basically all of their top export markets except for the US, but by far that growth was driven by China. So we've seen, you know, as we look, if we looked at a longer term lens before 2019, if we were looking at a longer term chart than this, we've seen Australia's increase in the global export share as New Zealand's has declined somewhat, as overall their production has been declining with competition for the land from especially the forestry and dairy sectors as well that have been prioritized. So we do see this continued increase in dominance from Australia on the global export side. The EU and UK are also large suppliers primarily to each other, and that trade was disrupted a bit by Brexit. And then you can see some of the other top suppliers here. I left a couple off the chart, like Mongolia, who mainly supplies to Iran, Kenya, who supplies more to regional, and some of the Central Asian countries like Kazakhstan that are supplying to other Central Asian countries as well. So, our main competitors, really Australia is our primary competitor in most of the markets that we're supplying. And then, of course, in the US market, Uruguay and Chile are more important as well. And so if we look at, I just included this a little closer look at Australia in case it would be of interest to see their latest export data. So this is Australia's monthly exports to their top 6 export markets. So again, you can see China is the dark blue line with shipments increasing in 2023 and really ramping up at the end of the year. And the same for the US. So shipments were lower in 2023 from Australia to the US, but volumes picked up in December. And that's product that we won't have seen come through on the US import data yet because of the time lag between when exports and imports are reported. So we should start to see those volumes in January and February, as it takes time for the product to transit and then clear imports. So again, just noting that seasonal uptick from Australia. They, had a record banner year in 2023 for exports, an increase in the flock. They expect to see, continued increases for exports in 2024 and 2025. The majority of their production is going to export, so they are geared more toward that export market now. And
Jessica?
Yes.
Oh, we have a question here.
Yes.
They want you to define the criteria you use for a mutton. And then
Okay.
if you could go back to the import slide for the US.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so for mutton, so basically the wording is just dependent on the HS code. So all these charts that I'm showing are from Trade Data Monitor. And so the way that they do the HS codes are that lamb and mutton are always grouped together. There is no differentiation within the data. That's the way that most countries harmonize the data. Australia does break out some of their data by lamb and mutton. So I would have to look more closely at their exact definition for the trade data. In the US, we don't break out our data, but of course, the vast majority of US production and exports are lamb, which we'll talk about. And that is something we're going to get to here as well. That is a difference between the US and other suppliers, is that we do have that high percentage of lamb. So in the trade data, like in these charts and data, we don't have any way to see the breakout for like Australia and New Zealand on lamb and mutton, but Australia does put out some reports where they break out those totals. Some of that is on the MLA website, but it's not in a uniform comparison across the markets.
Okay. And so the follow-up question to that, and maybe you're going to get to this, is explain why we are exporting lamb meat when we are importing 74% of all the lamb consumed in the US. Yes,
we will get to that. And we will talk about that exports are, we'll get more into that. And exports, we're going to talk about the share of production that's exported as well, which is a small share. So just around 4% of our US production is exported. So we will talk about that and put that in context as we get through a little bit further. But that's all coming up. So stay tuned. No problem. And feel free, please, if any other questions come up in relevance to the slides, I'm happy to take them as they come up as well. Okay, so getting in a little bit more on the US details. So US exports are, we saw this significant downshift in 2020. And so there were a couple of factors going on there. So of course, we had the strength of the domestic market due to COVID and kind of the shifts in demand that we saw there, and the preference for all red meat products from US consumers, and very strong growth in domestic demand for lamb those years. We also had logistics disruptions for exporting, disruptions in many of the markets where we ship product for tourism. So they had lockdowns. We're not seeing the usual tourism. So that led to some of the decrease. And then, of course, when the Rosen plant closed, that was also one of our major exporters. So there were some shifts there initially. And we have seen this very strong rebound in lamb exports in 2022, coming out of that, coming out of the pandemic as restrictions were eased in many of the countries that are our main export markets. And we've seen a little bit of an adjustment downward in 2023. And to the point of this question is we'll continue to talk about, we are more limited on supply, of course. We are a niche exporter, so we are, you know, the international market adds a competing bid for some of these alternative cuts or cuts that might need to be pushed at certain times. And so that's where the international market can really add value to be demanding more complementary cuts, not just, you know, racks and chops for food service. So we'll talk about that as we go through the slides a little bit more as well. And on the breakout by market, so this is again just showing this data that was just released yesterday. So our top market by far, now Mexico has rebounded a bit. So our top market is the Caribbean plus the Dominican Republic. And we saw very strong growth in 2022 as they saw a very strong rebound in their tourism. Cruise ships were booked, hotels were booked, all the markets, you know, across all the big tourism markets were doing very well. So some adjustment downward this year as that's leveling out a bit. On Mexico is our second largest market. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail here shortly as well. Canada, Central America, Guatemala, and Panama are growing markets for us in Central America. And in the ASEAN, we've heard increased interest from the Philippines and an importer there that has been working on promoting U.S. lamb. And so we'll talk about that in a little more detail as well. And so here's another point to the question about why we export. And so, you know, the importance for exports comes in where we can add this competing bid for products and help elevate prices in the US by having that competing bid. So having a third buyer, having the international buyer as well. And so, you know, one of the good examples of this is Mexico, where there is demand for necks and heads for birria tacos. So really that is a major consumption pattern, and for barbacoa. So we have those, that importance in their food culture. And so that fits with supply that we might not be moving here for heads and necks, which wouldn't be as demanded in the US. And you know, we've worked, especially in the Caribbean. Our staff person there is fantastic, and she has really worked on going beyond the rack for food service in the Caribbean, and so working more on shoulders and legs and applications for how they can use those. And then, you know, some of our newer markets, so Japan and Taiwan are more recent markets where the US just gained access for exports in recent years. And so those markets are still at the initial stages of being introduced to US lamb. US lamb is by far a price premium to Australian and New Zealand lamb in the market. And so as they're educating consumers and importers and, you know, these chefs at high-end hotels about the US attributes, that's at the very beginning of the chain, where it is just chops and racks are the main items. And we're moving through education to try and move beyond that, you know, from that starting point as the market opens. And so this metric here, I'm going to just take a minute to explain what this is. So this is showing the export value per head for all federally inspected sheep and lamb slaughter in the US. And the way that we calculate this is not meant to show an added value or anything like that from exports. This is simply the calculation of that 12 million that we did in exports last year, divided by total sheep and lamb slaughter in the US during the same time period. So we are only exporting, you know, about 4% of US lamb production. However, if you take the export value divided by all sheep and lamb slaughter in the US, that equates to over $6 per head right now. So that is a way for us to track over time, you know, and see how we see that value divided by sheep and lamb slaughter. So back in 2011 and 2012 were some of the higher years when we had record export levels those years. And again, as we've seen a smaller share of US lamb being exported, we've seen some pullback in those numbers, but I think it's important to remember that this is across entire sheep and lamb slaughter in the US, even though we are only exporting a small percent of production. Okay, and
Jessica,
for now,
do you know,
yes.
Jessica, do we know where those cruise travels are originating from? Are they originating from a US port or a foreign port?
Most are US ports, but not all. So there are foreign ports, and for the Caribbean, their outlook for bookings is still really strong. They have seen a little bit of, you know, more frugal travelers. So before, you know, in 2022, everyone was willing to spend. So we are, you know, working on some of our marketing on helping to adjust food service operators to be able to kind of accommodate those more frugal travelers. And that's where alternative cuts become more important. But most of the Caribbean destinations have a lot of US, it's mostly from US and a lot of US visitors. But depending on the island, there are some heavy visitors from the EU as well. So especially some of our former British islands where that lamb influence would be really important also.
Thank you.
All right, and now back to Courtney.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk a little bit about how US lamb is very different from the rest of the lamb produced around the world. We call it a niche market or a niche market, however you want to pronounce it. And it's because it really is. We predominantly have grain-fed lamb. It, in general, has a larger muscle size from a cut standpoint. It's definitely grain-fed. It doesn't have that gamey grass-fed taste compared to Australian or New Zealand lamb. We are very different in how we choose our genetics and our growth goals overall. So the primary exports or the primary production in general is meat breeds for export versus those wool breeds that we'll see from our competitors. Again, back to grain fed, we actually have feedlots for our lambs where they're seeing 30 to 45 days on grain, which yields superior muscling, marbling, and flank streaking. Therefore, the majority of our lambs, 90%, grade either choice or prime, indicating a youthful carcass or a youthful lamb in general, which sets us above and differently from a lot of our competitor markets. The sizes and breeds that we use are different as well. A majority are hybrid crosses, multi-purpose, and we like to see that it results in a faster growing lamb, which helps yield that better, sweeter flavor with, you know, that less gamey flavor. We all know lamb fat has a very distinctive flavor, and ours is actually less distinctive than if you were to eat lamb in some of our competitor markets.
Thanks, Courtney. You want me to
Well,
move on?
I can take the question. How are we identifying if lamb meat is from a hair sheep or a wool sheep? I do not think that there is any sort of a data distinguishing system at this point in time. And Jessica can speak to that, but my experience and exposure is we're not differentiating those at this time.
Right.
Okay, and then where are most lamb feedlots located in the US? That one, and Travis might actually know this better than I do. Or Jessica, you might want to speak. I know Colorado has a lot, but that's because that's where I've lived and seen them. There may be more to speak to, and this is a thing I need to learn.
Awesome, Courtney. I'll take it. All right. So a large part of our lambs, I mean, there are individuals particularly from a farmer feeder standpoint, in all portions of the United States that wish to kind of pull those, if I was to say it, from 60 to 80 pounds to 130 to 150. But primarily, the four largest lamb feedlots are in Colorado. That was cool because, again, both Courtney and I got to spend some time at Colorado State University. And it was just right there on the Front Range. It's a great place because the humidity is low. Lambs love it. They just live their dream. And so a large part, and the infrastructure of having now 2 processing plants in Colorado, four of the largest lamb feedlots are within about a 40-mile radius. So that's the home base.
Awesome. Thank you. And then I'm going to hand this presentation back over to Jessica to talk about the Caribbean.
All right. So now Courtney and I are going to get into some of the marketing details for the international marketplace, and we'll close then after that on some of our forecasts. And as we look ahead, kind of comparing where we see per capita consumption and imports for some of the markets that the U.S. is focused on. So to start, as we saw a few slides ago, the Caribbean and the Dominican Republic are some of the top markets for U.S. lamb exports. So in the Caribbean, the Netherlands, Antilles, Bahamas, Leeward, Windward Islands are some of the main markets. The Netherlands, Antilles, and Leeward, Windward Islands are collections of islands, and those groups reflect some of the former British islands. So those being some of the main customers for U.S. lamb. So, we see the British Virgin Islands are included there, where we see some of that importance. And, Bermuda, there's strong lamb presence in both retail and food service in Bermuda and the Caribbean. And we have heard increased interest from that market, as well as the Cayman Islands in recent months. The Cayman Islands is a market that really was a standout for tourist performance during COVID and has remained strong since. So they have had very strong imports across all proteins and continuing that development there. And, as we look at the Caribbean region, this is the market where we have the most suppliers of U.S. lamb active in the marketplace. So these continue to be really important markets that we're focused on, and really the education here, as I mentioned, on alternative cuts and working and training at food service and at retail as well, because there is some U.S. lamb at retail on merchandising at retail, food service, education for chefs on best practices, how to market these things on your menu, and working to continue to grow that presence of U.S. lamb there. So we have a bit of a newer market for U.S. lamb is Jamaica. And so this, I wanted to highlight this a little bit. So we recently had the debut of U.S. lamb in Jamaica. So one importer started bringing in U.S. lamb after attending the Center of the Plate trainings and events in the U.S. They were on a team from USMEF, and they happened to sit next to a representative from a lamb exporter at the event. And we're talking about U.S. lamb. And through that partnership, they really wanted to start offering that to their clients. So the importer has since brought in kind of a wide range of products. So they did racks, but also dinner ribs. They did lamb burgers and ground lamb. And so this is a new for U.S. lamb in 2023. And with that, we did some kickoff events with one of the importer's clients, who is a very high-end retail store. So they did cooking classes and promos. And here you can see just a short video clip we got from that event there. So showcasing the racks during the cooking class. Or chops. And our other main market is Mexico. So I'm going to show a video here in a minute from a recent event that we did in Mexico, but I have the chart here, showing supplies in the market. So Mexico is a largely self-sufficient market in lamb production, but they are a major import market as well. And you can see that there is still room to rebound for their overall supplies in the market. And Australia and New Zealand are our competitors in the market. We did previously have a tariff advantage for US exports to Mexico through USMCA. But because of CPTPP, so the comprehensive free trade agreement with Mexico as one of the parties, along with both Australia and New Zealand, means that they now have seen a reduction in their tariffs to Mexico, and those are phasing down to zero and are now minimal. So there has been a reduction in tariffs for Australia and for New Zealand. And so we do see that competition there. But, overall, the Mexico market has a lot of positives going on in the tourism and food service sector. Cancun has been a big driver of growth. And so there is optimism for the future as we continue to see that development. But really the chart here to show you that, we are total import supplies for Mexico rebounded in 2023, but there still is further room for growth to get back to some of those recent recent volumes just past the past 5 years. So we had a big event, a kind of a unique event just a couple months ago in Mexico to introduce some of the US lamb exporters to the biggest Mexican food service and retail buyers. And so I'm going to show a video now. This video is a couple minutes that will go into a lot more detail on that event.
Expansion in the food service sector in Mexico is building demand for high quality protein and providing opportunity for US lamb. The US Meat Export Federation team up with the American Lamb Board and USDA access.
Jessica, we had sound early. It's left us.
Oh no. Uh-oh. Well, let me just check. Yeah, that's odd because and let me try one more time.
Expansion in the food service
Can you hear
sector
that?
in Mexico is building demand for high quality protein and providing opportunity for US lamb. The US Meat Export Federation
Volume? No. You can no. Okay. Okay. Well, let's just switch it back. All right. Last try.
Expansion in the food service sector in Mexico is building demand for high
Did that
quality
work?
protein and providing opportunity for US lamb. The US Meat Export
Did it start having volume? And then it went away. It started and stopped.
Yes.
Oh, that is such a bummer. Okay. We may just have to skip it because I would start and then not have volume. Okay, last try and then we'll
expansion
give
in the
up.
food service sector in Mexico is
Worse than.
Okay, well, you know what? We're just gonna skip through so you can see some of the images. I'm so sorry, I don't know why it's doing that, but so there was a product showcase at this event, and there were 2 US exporters, and there was a a big educational component here. So there was a cutting demonstration by our chef in Mexico. So he did a cutting, as you can see, and then talked about some of the different applications. And so there were the biggest food service and retail buyers for some of the major chains in Mexico in the room. And some of them had imported US lamb before, but some never had. So there were new connections here as well, even among some of the most established importers. And with that time, you know, they were able to meet one-on-one with the importers and with the US exporters and to talk about product availability and what might work for them. So I really apologize. I'm not sure why the sound started and stopped, but sorry about that. And hopefully you got a bit of an idea from me skimming through the video there. And now it's back to Courtney for the next couple markets.
Yeah, I want to share with you guys some of our efforts in the Asian segment of our industry. First, we'll start with Southeast Asia and the Philippines. Here is information in front of us from our summer WolfX show in the Philippines. Our primary goal for this market this time was to really expand our footprint, both at the show and with the amount of people that we can reach. If you look, the photo with the group picture is our staff and their various representatives to help market all US meats, but we had a special feature on US lamb. Excuse me. So we focused on connecting lamb exporters to even more import buyers. Excuse me, with a goal of not just meeting buyers, but also marketing and meeting with those downstream, either at retail or in the restaurant industry. Our booth space at food shows is always really active. We try to have a lot of people, a lot of energy, photos, cooking demonstrations, and samples. And this year, we hosted something called the Philippines Culinary Cup. And excuse me, I'm sorry, I have had a cold all week. A yearly highlight of ours is that this culinary cup where professionals participate in a one-day cooking competition. In this particular event this summer, there were 28 chefs, and they were all challenged to create unique and delicious recipes with lamb riblets, specifically US lamb riblets. There were more than 61,900 visitors in attendance, many of which came and watched parts of this 28 chef contest. And US lamb went over really, really well. And we continue to keep expanding in that market as our product is really, really well received in that market. And we have some great staff in that region that really understand both their market and our product. And then Jessica, can you go to the next one? Thanks. And then a really new and exciting opportunity is in Japan. We're focusing on the high-end positioning in Japan, so at those high-end steakhouses. And in June, I need to tell you, to the far right is the picture with the two girls with the sign, and that was for a giant lamb festival. And there were something like 40,000 attendees who paid to go to this US lamb festival or this lamb festival. And I mean, they paid to go. So there's a lot of excitement around lamb. There are a lot of lamb lovers in Japan. And we were super excited to participate. There were other organizations there, not just US, but it looks like people were very excited to learn about our product, have photos taken at our booth, and to try American lamb stir fry noodle dishes. we were able to give out and sell 1,000 portions of that specific product, and are just really excited that this gets to be part of our marketing efforts in Japan. You can see on the far left one of the plated lamb servings that we have in a restaurant that carries our products. In June, we had 13 hand-selected chefs participating in our teppanyaki seminar in Osaka. And this is where we focus on luxury cuisine. Individual chefs use an iron griddle to cook in front of like select guests, and through cooking and demonstrations and tasting sessions, we were able to introduce French cut rack chops, boneless loin, and bone-in loin chops to the various participants, really showcasing how high quality US lamb is when compared to our competitors, and helping to get it onto a lot of those high-end restaurant menus. And just as of note for Japan, in 2024, we're expecting the number of overseas tourists to continue to increase. In recent months, the number has returned to roughly the same level as before COVID, particularly in these regions, especially Japan. And we expect this trend to continue throughout this year. And with that, we're seeing that customers, especially tourists, are going to every kind of restaurant in Japan, and they are experiencing our products used in Japanese style cooking in their traditional and in their more tourist focused restaurants. All right, I'm ready for the next one. Thanks, Jessica. Here's a slide that shows the primary lamb import markets. Specifically, those in green, we have access to. Those in red, we don't at the moment. Most of our access issues for these countries are related to scrapie bans or scrapie related bans. So some of these didn't exist until BSE happened in 2003 and 2004, were when most of those closures occurred. And so now we're working with USDA very slowly, but very intentionally, to open up and gain access where we can. It's important to note each of these countries require like government to government trade negotiations, and it can take time as we all work. So ASI and USMEF, for example, will be consulted by the government as they work through these various bilateral discussions to make sure things work for the industry. And there are often comment periods and huge delays, and politics get involved. So it's one of those things, like it can take 10 years to get it back into a market, but we are definitely working on them. And we're really intentional about entering markets that we think will be good for us.
So we just have 2 slides left before we get into any more questions and discussion. And I'll take a minute to talk through this slide, but the point that we really want to emphasize on the next 2 slides is, yes, there would be, there's huge potential in some of the markets that we don't have access to right now for the major global importers. China is a standout there as the largest importer, and it's a market that the US does not have access to. However, as we know, and as we've kind of, discussed a little bit earlier on, supply is a limiting factor on the US side. And so with the markets that we have now, we are hearing more interest pick up, especially as we, come out of these pandemic related slowdowns. And something I should have mentioned earlier is that, it may sound a little bit weird that we're still referring to COVID, because in our minds, that was long history ago. But in a lot of our Asian markets, and in some of the other markets around the world, they still had really significant restrictions in place for travel, in place for people in public places, as recently as late 2022 and early 2023. So we're just coming out of that in some of the main importing markets. So as we've seen this pick up in demand, in the markets where we do have access, we are hearing for more increased interest in U.S. lamb. I mentioned Bermuda and the Cayman Islands. We've heard that from our staff in the Caribbean. We're hearing from the Philippines, more interest in the Middle East. We're hearing more, Kuwait specifically was looking for more supplies. So there are markets where we are already focused, that we see potential for growth there, even without any access increases at the moment. And so it does remain a focus to increase market access, but we are optimistic because of the pickup and the demand that we're seeing in some of these export markets where we are already, we do have good access conditions. And of course, our newest access markets are Taiwan and Japan, where we're starting to see that pipeline develop a little bit more as well. So this slide is only showing imports per capita. So this is not total consumption. This is only consumption from imports in each of these markets. This is in pounds. So sorry, all my other charts were in metric tons for global trade, but this one is in pounds, not in kilograms. And this is on a product weight basis. So I'm using the conversion from USDA ERS. So that's 89% of the carcass weight basis. So this is on a product weight basis, so it won't line up with carcass weight estimates. But showing this, you can see, of course, I have the US here, and as was mentioned earlier, 70% of US consumption is from imports, and the US is one of the major global importers on a per capita basis. That is less than 1 pound per person. And so you can see where our real standouts are on some of these per capita imports are the Middle East. I just have the UAE and Jordan on here, but the Middle East is a very high area for per capita imports, of course, with the importance of lamb for holidays and the cultural importance in food. And also Taiwan is a standout where they have very limited domestic production. And there is the food service culture of lamb with these Mongolian barbecue restaurants that are popular in Korea and Taiwan. So we see higher imports per capita there, in Canada as well, in Jamaica with the British influence. So that leading to higher lamb consumption in the Caribbean markets that have British influence. And then also in the Caribbean markets with high per capita income, we see higher per capita imports of lamb as well. But some of these markets that I mentioned, so Mexico, Dominican Republic, and the Philippines, all of these markets, Mexico, DR, and Philippines have very small per capita imports right now. They are all markets where we're really seeing that drive for lamb from the growth in the tourism sector. And as they see, DR has a booming tourism sector that has continued to develop beyond just the all-inclusive. So now a wider range of tourism. Mexico, I mentioned Cancun is one of the leaders where we've seen strong tourist arrivals continuing. And the Philippines, we're seeing more development of that as well. So just to note here that there is opportunity to grow this just purely on this per capita import basis. You can see that there is the potential to continue to develop that pipeline there. And on my last slide here, before we get into any discussion, because of that potential, we have penciled in modest growth in exports over the next 5 years. So we do put out an export forecast twice a year, and we submit this to USDA once a year. So in our, we have something called a UES, or Unified Export Strategy, that's reviewed by USDA before we receive funding. And so as a part of that, we do put forward forecasts. And because of the optimism or the potential for growth that we see in those markets, that's why I'm more optimistic for some modest growth. Again, this is just penciling very modest growth. These are very modest forecasts, but considering the share of production would have to be increased to meet these. So as we continue to see, this kind of long-term slight decrease in US lamb production year over year, we will need to have a higher share of production that is exported in order to meet these forecasts. So we, in 2018 and 2019, so before the Rosen closure and before COVID, we were exporting a little over 4% of production. And that dropped in 2020 and 2021 as we saw those pandemic, related disruptions, but also the huge domestic demand. So the big surge in domestic demand those years as well. So we saw that shift. And then the share exported rebounded again over the last 2 years. So back more normal towards the levels that we had seen in 2018 and 2019. But if we do want to increase exports, and we see that, and the importance and the value that that can add to the industry, we would need to see over 5% of production being exported to reach those modest growth levels in 2027 and 2028. And that growth that I have forecast would really primarily be driven by Mexico, and also some increases in the Caribbean and some increases in parts of Central America as well. But the main increase would be driven by Mexico to reach that level. So that's our latest thought on where we could see exports going. There is potential to increase that further. We hear interest from the international markets, but of course the US domestic market is very strong, and that is the major focus. So we will continue to educate on some of the alternative cuts. We didn't talk about it quite as much, but we're doing a lot more on legs, especially as well in the Caribbean. In Japan, Courtney was mentioning that they sold 1,000 stir fry noodles, and those were made with, that was US legs that they used for that product as well. So when we have the more limited supply, it's important that we're adding that value by adding the bid for some of these underutilized cuts in the US, and some of those variety meat items as well. So I did not really talk about that today because that's just a minor share of what we export. But especially heads and necks, those are important items for some of the Caribbean markets and for Mexico especially. And so with that, I would like to just really thank you all for your time and attention this evening, and I'm happy to get into any other discussions and questions that have come up.
Awesome. Thank you, Jessica. I kindly appreciate kind of your thoughts and processes on there, and kind of, identifying truthfully opportunities for it. And I think when we think about this, and again, our audience, Jessica and Courtney, and again, my apologies, Courtney, I feel so silly. I know that you are a sheep producer and have been a long time sheep producer, so appreciate you pointing that in and reminding me of that as well, and Jessica's efforts on what we do. But I think one thing that could keep into consideration is that the products, and help me, Jessica, on this as well, is that even when you put the slide up of where those products are going, and you showed some French racks and some loins and some legs and everything in between, is that a thing that to be considerate of, and this isn't unique to the sheep industry, it's also the beef industry and the pork industry as well, that you obviously have a greater amount of them, that there's two things in my mind. And so one of those things is that those highest value cuts, okay, of calling it, and again, sorry, Jessica, I don't even know if this will come out as a question. I'm going to dig it too there. But the highest value cuts that we have of, you see cap off racks, going to different locations to Canada. And so those that you are doing that with are ones that you can potentially put a margin on than what we are currently selling them. And then there's also like kind of a bimodal type thing, because you can pick the cuts that are like, whoa, this is great. Let's sell that to the Caribbean so that we can put it on a cruise ship. And then there's the second one that probably is outside of the mainstream, that is more of either the offals or the shoulders or the shanks. And so to me, in my ideas of where we're pulling those things together, it feels as though it's kind of just like bimodal. Like, let's take this one and make it right here. And so some of the questions said, why would we do this? Well, if we could sell a $9.99 loin, why can't we sell it for $12.99 to the Middle East, right? And then the other thing is that from the option cuts of an offal or a shank or something that's lower value, can we add value to that? And so I think that we need to consider that the reasons that we are exporting, tell me when I'm wrong, Jessica, is that there's market capitalization or value to those. And so those that are on the lowest end of pulling them up a little bit, or those that are on the highest end to pull them up even higher. I welcome your thoughts on that one, and that's actually my most exciting question.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Yep. So it's all about finding the highest bidder for the product. And in the case of lamb, a lot of times the highest bidder is in the US, right? So that's why we have that smaller share of exports. The US is the highest bidder for other lamb markets as well. So we see that reflected, you know, in the US being a major market for Australia and New Zealand. So the US is a, you know, and this is a little bit similar. The lamb and beef export and import markets are a little bit similar in the US because on the beef side, we export, you know, less than 15% of production, and we're also one of the major importers as well on the beef side. So the volume is large on beef, but the percentages are closer to the lamb market, and it's the same driving factors. So it is all about lining up the product with who is going to ever pay the highest for that, and that's what gives us that 12 million in export value that divides out across total slaughter in the US to give us that, you know, $6.50 per head. So yes, and it's totally the two sides, as you said. So the highest end, you know, these steakhouses and the teppanyaki restaurants in Japan and Taiwan, you know, Peter Luger in Japan is one of the main users of US lamb. And so those are very high-end products. There are more, you know, there are a lot of high-end consumers in some of these Asian markets. So when we really start to look around the world of where these high wealth households outside the US, a lot of those markets are in Asia. So that's why we see some of those the biggest global importers being in some of those Asian markets as well. So it's a very high end, and then matching the need for some of those like more push products, like you were saying with offal or with shoulders, as you know, balancing seasonality is also important. When we consume, our high points of consumption are not the same as all the markets around the world, right? So we're driven by holidays, as are other markets. Tourism season, high season in the Caribbean drives their consumption, and that differs by market. So that helps to balance seasonality as well a bit with the export market. So that's another important point where that can come in. But no, you're exactly right, Travis.
Thank you for sharing that portion of it. I think that there's a great question in there, and in fact, this is larger than my intellectual talents allow, but totally in terms of just the strength of the US dollar. Man, that's such a big question, and it changes left, right, indifferent, up and down, and somewhere in between, right? And so, I mean, that has a huge impact in terms of what market capital that we have and kind of how we describe that. And so, Jessica, that's something that we could obviously spend like 30 minutes on, but I'm going to like task you for 2.5.
Okay, good. Perfect. Well, yes, it has a huge impact. You know, our record year for lamb exports in 2011 and 2012 was when we had a weak US dollar. So that definitely provided a tailwind for exports, and that's for not lamb, that's for all products as well. So when the dollar is strong, we typically are pulling in more exports or more imports, and we are less competitive compared to the other exporters. And it also matters for the import market. So like right now, you know, last year, it was a very tough year for Japan, for their consumption because their currency was so weak compared to the dollar that it was really hard for them the importers to bring in products. So it does have a big impact. And I won't get into any forecasting of where I think the strength of the dollar will go because that's beyond my brain capacity as well. But I will say that we have been in kind of this strong dollar environment for a while now, with all of these geopolitical issues, pandemic issues, the haven of the US currency. So we have been in this strong US dollar environment now, and we do continue to see importers adjust to that. But to know on the importing side as well that that does encourage more imports in the US. It is a headwind for us to export, but I think that, you know, especially in some of these markets for land, like in the Middle East, for some of the global land markets, that's obviously more of a factor. For Australia, for instance, they are continuing to bring products. So even in the face of these higher prices and currency issues, we continue to see strong demand in some parts of the world.
Okay, probably as best of a question as that we can have. A colleague joined us, and maybe you saw that the U.S. imports 70%, 75% of our consumption. Can U.S. producers increase their production to capture a portion of that number? Let's go.
Do you want to hop on too, Courtney?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, it's really hard to say if we can or not.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Regulations, I mean, Travis and Courtney know much better than me on regulations and some of those factors that have kind of hindered any growth in production.
Okay, I'll take it, Jessica. Okay, so some of our research that we have that compares the Australian and New Zealand imports in comparison to the United States of America of our American lamb, and we can continue to say that we provide a consistent and high quality product. But one of the things, even when we ask retailers and food service of what that cost differential may be, and this is done on actually more than 2 studies, is that it's approximately about 30%. Okay. And I know that that's a vague number, but it's not really if we get the same number every time. Is that the US or American lamb, if you were a retailer or a food service person, is that we're willing to pay 30% more for, let's call it the lamb loin and the lamb loin chops. Okay. And so if the Australian lamb is coming in at $9.99 and we can sell ours at $12.99, we can still win. But when our lamb loin chop comes in at $16.99, it becomes tougher. Okay, and that becomes the same in terms of the retail and the food service, is that those willing to make those decisions on what goes out of their stores or their restaurants is what we found is that the 30% number seems to be an intriguing part. When we become 50% more expensive, then that kind of hurts us a little bit, and then we potentially may or may not lose a purchaser based on that. And so hopefully we don't. But one of the things that I think that to keep into consideration, even as the discussion has went to imports, is that I really appreciate Jessica and Courtney of identifying what export markets that we have. And I think that that needs to be taken into consideration of saying, you know what, there are opportunities that we can sell product that's raised domestically from the United States of America and to be able to sell that at a premium. And so when you think about it, and Jessica talked about it, of cruise ships and Cancun and the Dominican Republic, if we can put those on there, then those are things that add value to what we do. And so if we can do that at a higher price than what we're currently selling it for, then we've provided equity to the whole supply chain. Jessica, did I catch that right?
Perfect.
So recently, Governor Walz of Minnesota went on a trade mission to Australia. And of course, enter in the politics, Minnesota is the large producer of sugar. Well, Australia also wants to import sugar, but Minnesota wants to protect their sugar market. So enter that, you know, so that was part of the trade talks that I had heard. And also, I mean, I think the other part is to talk about the quality, and you're doing that. And I don't know if these restaurants and chefs know how the sheep and, well, the lamb and the goats are raised in Australia. And also, Travis, you also brought up, Travis, too, the quality there. We're talking about grain-fed animals. So the way it was described to me is that they're largely free range, and they don't know. So go back to the question of it, is it lamb or mutton? Many times they don't know if it's lamb or mutton because they can't age it, because it's been on these large ranges, and you could get a 2-year-old male, or you could get a 6-year-old ewe. You just don't know what they're putting and what is going into the packing plants there. So just a comment, and someone had shared that with me, and the someone who had been on the trade mission with Governor Walz.
Yeah, I'll take that just a little bit. Is that we have control of what we have control of, and I call that the United States of America. Is that we have a guideline in place that in order to be USDA choice or prime from a quality grade standpoint, is that they need to have a break joint. And in order to be merchandised as lamb, there's 3 things that can happen. An animal can be non-eruption of the first incisors of the teeth, have a break joint in comparison to a break or spool joint, or have written documentation that the animal is under 14 months of age. And so I have full confidence in what we do. Our job is not to manage or monitor everybody else. All right, Jessica, my apologies. All right, because we only have control of what we do. And in fact, Australia and New Zealand primarily goes to dentition. In fact, it's not just dentition of when the first 2 eruption of the first and second incisors are, but now they've changed it just a little bit to when that first and second incisors meet the pad or the upper goom of the animal, of where those would be expected to potentially be considered lamb versus mutton. There's several reasons of why we kind of categorize that from lamb to mutton, and that can be a function for a different topic and a different day. But there's intensification of flavors. There's intensification of toughness of our products as animals age. But I think that there's opportunity to reevaluate that. And we're kind of working with that with lots of different people on differences on mutton versus lamb and where those have an impact on it. But there's a lot of other things that aren't just age. It's about diet. It's about also where those animals are on kind of pulling it through the system of making sure that they're correct in terms of just gaining some weight and on a nutritional plane as well. Sorry that, Jessica, I took too much on that one, but I believe in our system right now in terms of the correspondence between lamb and mutton, and those other countries get to define it as they so aspire to, but it's not nearly as different as what people would like to think that are looking at it outside the box. And in fact, I will tell you that in my personal opinion, that Australia and New Zealand's differentiation between lamb and mutton is more stringent than the United States designation right now. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, and I would add to the point that, yes, education is extremely important, as you said, Colleen, and that is a big focus. And especially because, you know, I'm going to use an example here of some of the newer markets, so Taiwan and Japan, where Australia has been in those markets, and New Zealand, but Australia is the main competitor there, has been in those markets for decades. And Australia does have a very positive reputation in a lot of the Asian markets as an agricultural supplier. So they have they've really marketed on like clean and sustainable Australia. And so they do have a strong reputation. However, the USDA, like just USDA itself and the USDA Shield, those have very strong recognition and awareness in food safety in many countries around the world. So that is an important point for us. And as Courtney was saying, our main focus is really on the grain-fed differentiator and educating importers and buyers on that. But also it's important for the downstream as well. So, you know, I've seen our staff in the Caribbean, our representative there, I've seen her in action where she's talking to chefs about like how you talk about US lamb on a menu, you know, how you talk about these US products and why you recommend those on the menu and the eating experience there. Back when the market first opened in Taiwan, we had a staff meeting there at one point, and we had a event with a chef where they did a blind lamb tasting. And of course, the US stood out. It was US versus New Zealand at that time. And US, of course, was a standout on the blind tasting for these chefs. And again, the importance was then showing them like, how can they make money with this? What is your market proposition? Like, this is why you can price it higher, is because of the quality. So that's when it was a new product to the market. So education is an essential piece as we're trying to give this value proposition when we are higher, you know, the premium price for these items.
I had seen a question about production prices in Australia and New Zealand versus US, and production costs are much lower in Australia and New Zealand. And it's also important to note that they're at a liquidation stage of their flock size in general. They are not making money and prices are low because there's just an oversupply of lamb right now. And that looks very different from what we're working with, of course.
A question came in there of just the difference in terms of what the stage of the animal that turns to export. And I'll take this one a little bit, and Jessica, and you can catch me when I'm wrong. But the products that we get in into the U.S. as imported products are in a carcass form for the most part. Okay, and so those aren't coming in as sheep. And in fact they're probably not even coming in as cuts. Maybe some of them would be as in just cut down to primals, but a lot of those will be coming in as carcasses and then fabricated as well to different retail and food service, or truthfully even the purveyor. Okay, and so the purveyor that kind of works in between, probably that's actually one of the things that would be of larger imports standpoint. But those products are shipped primarily via boat at a low temperature, and those are coming in as chilled, not frozen products from either Australia and or New Zealand. But Jessica, am I missing anything in terms of what we're coming in that truthfully is our competition? And so I'm going to pose this just a little bit differently, is that I absolutely love what Jessica and Courtney and the U.S. Meat Export Federation are doing to try to build markets for us. But when we think about it from the sheep producers that are on today's call and will watch this at a later time, is that they're at least intrigued and or challenged by what is an import and why are they grabbing a little bit more of our market, and so that's the biggest challenge that we have truthfully in our U.S. sheep industry. And Courtney touched on that a little bit earlier, is that they have a lower cost of production, and we get that, okay? A colleague pointed at us on the strength of the dollar. Those things are things that happen at a much larger level than what we have in our farm, right? Okay, we want to go out and feed the animals and lamb them out now because it's February and know that we can go to the barn and have a pair of twins outside, all right? And so those are the things that we have impacts of, and some of those things are just so macroeconomically changed that we don't always have control of. And so, Jessica, I appreciate what you do and what Courtney does on just trying to build some of our outside, impacts as well. With this slide that you have up there of saying, you know what, these are some things where we can add opportunity. Courtney, tag, you're it.
Okay, I can answer the questions about who exports and how to export. Primarily the people who export, they're either traders, so people who buy US lamb from USDA inspected facilities and export it according to US and foreign government requirements, or packing plants also directly export. If you are interested in exporting, we can talk at some point. You, in general, absolutely have to have your lamb slaughtered at a USDA facility, and that USDA facility can either work with a trader or can work on its own and make relationships with buyers in other countries and then proceed from there. And then we have another question. Do we have information on where the imported lamb in the US goes? I don't know about that question.
No, not where it would go once it arrives, no. And is maybe Travis, I don't think the lamb cold storage data has any regional details, right? It's just total. So no. There are some like private data sources where you could see the arrival port, but that's as specific as it would get.
The next question was, how many USDA facilities are there in the US for processing? So for USDA facilities, there are actually many that are USDA approved. But as far as those that export, I think it's a smaller number. Obviously, like the largest ones, the largest 6 that we saw export. But basically any USDA facility can, and we can look. And if you can't figure this out on your own, just let us know. But there is a list of all USDA inspected facilities on the USDA website, and we can search specifically for lamb. And they'll have all of their information, location, contact information, things like that. So then you can know if there's a plant near you that's USDA, and it can be very small or very large, and work from there.
Yeah, I think the important thing to add on that, Courtney, as willing, is that, you saw it that it's $7, $8. Hopefully we get to $10, right, per lamb return that is export value, Jessica. I mean, even when we think about that. But one of the things is to keep into consideration, and all of those people that are here as participants understand, is that we're producing a premium product. And I say that from a positive standpoint of saying, you know what, we produce one of the best proteins in the world. Okay. And again, that was arrogant on my end, Jessica, because you get to work with beef and pork and everything in between. But we produce a high-end product. Okay. And we need to realize that that's what we do. And that's what the decision is made in terms of value at the particular retail case. Okay. And so nobody that is producing sheep and or lambs in the United States wants to sell it for a cheaper level. Okay. That's not what we're doing. We want to sell it at a premium level. And in fact, in terms of just dressing percentage and retail yield, we're at a competitive disadvantage from pork and or beef in comparison. Okay. And so that's true. It's real. We know that we're producing a high-end, high quality, and truthfully a premium product. And so when Jessica and Courtney dig into these export markets and that we can potentially sell them at a higher level, then that's a bonus that adds the value to the chain. We have to understand that we are not the sole competitors in this, right? And so if there's things that we can do to improve efficiencies of the US product and or to try to make those to be merchandisable at the retail and food service sector, then hopefully we can make some of those advantages. But I think that we needed, again, and that's not the focus of today's function, Jessica. But I mean, providing consistency and quality product is what we do, right? Okay. And so that's why when Jessica and Courtney go to the Caribbean and go to Japan, that we can tell our story and to be able to provide that and say, you know what, we produce American lamb and it's a premium product.
There have been a couple more questions. I do want to clarify that only USDA inspected facilities or lamb that's been slaughtered at a USDA inspected facility can be exported. And this is because our trade agreements are all based on federal requirements and very carefully done bilateral trade agreements. And we have the same expectations of those that we work with, no matter what commodity is that we're working on federal requirements.
I'm going to take a one that came in at the back end for you there, Jessica and Courtney, and said, do we have information on ethnic markets in the U.S. that are consuming lamb, kind of imported, exported, where are the hot spots for consumption in the States? And I think this is fun. Okay, so those of you that kind of follow us, again, this is hosted by the University of Minnesota Extension and North Dakota State University Extension. And I will tell you, Jessica, my apologies, but we don't have nearly enough lamb consumers in the state of North Dakota. Okay, we got 700,000 people, which isn't nearly enough to move the needle. My apologies. All right, Courtney, that's the game. Okay. Right.
I can speak this a little. I mean, I live in Michigan, right next to Detroit. We're one of the
grab
biggest
that one for us. Yeah.
in the country, and we don't have a lot of data and statistics because so much of the lamb that they buy is off the farm or direct. So there is so much unreported lamb sales in this country that I can't even begin to truly guess what our actual production levels are, especially in Michigan, in Ohio. So I would love to hear everybody's thoughts on this. This is something I know ASI has talked about wanting to learn about, and I think that we would all benefit greatly. Some people had talked about, wanting to see more put into domestic, and I agree. I think that needs to happen. As a producer myself, like USMEF, our job is, exports, and we love to add value to whatever we can. That is our goal, to help producers, to help the whole ag industry. But yeah, I'm wholly behind learning more about this.
Absolutely. And in fact, that will be a function that will be in part of our next session that will come in kind of some of the times this summer, because we want to dig in on the non-traditional or ethnic market. And in fact, my quick answer to that would be, as we think about it from the contiguous 48 states of the United States, is that the farther east that you go, the more that there is demand for lamb, and the more that there is demand for 60 to 80 to 90 pound lambs. Okay. And so it becomes, again, as strange as this is, and those that are in the sheep industry understand this, is that it's truthfully, again, a bimodal kind of a approach, is that those that want to take lambs to 130 to 160, and those that want to take lambs to 60 to 80 pounds live weight. And so it's becoming even more segmented than what we would have initially thought just a short decade ago. And so those do happen on our ethnic markets, and trying to meet those. And in fact, as we sit here on February 8th of 2024, is that we are coming in on holiday season. And so if you have lambs that are nearing 50, 60, 70 pounds, hey, now what do you want to bid 80? All right. So those lambs are worth a whole bunch of money. All right. And so the difference is that where that may be in comparison is again, a topic for another consideration. But I really, really appreciate kind of Jessica and Courtney kind of pulling this together of what we do primarily for lots of different parts of our lamb, because those that are young lambs that can be transitioned into the export market, and those that come from selling full racks and full loins and loin chops to Japan and Taiwan and Dubai and everywhere in between. So I appreciate everything that Jessica and Courtney have provided for us. You have a summary of a quick questionnaire that we'd appreciate that you filled out before we left us. But Jessica, thank you so much. All right. I think that one thing to keep into consideration, even when so many of us again on an evening in February, we say, you know what, we got to do this, but that's okay. We have an impact and say, you know what, I got to go out and lambing. But there's people on our teams, right? And so that's why we pulled you in. And so Courtney, you know, as a sheep producer and also Jessica, and kind of pulling all of this together, we really, really appreciate what you do to be driven to discover here at the University of Minnesota in our extension programs. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Travis. And thanks, everyone.